Now, this is why some programs might not work for you. And this is also why you can't just go following your favorite athlete or favorite lifter's program and have it just translate to whatever you're doing, or even just a famous training system. Think of anything, the Bulgarian weightlifting system, Westside, and any of the other famous programs I'll cover quickly. And one of the reasons is this idea of survivorship bias. And there's actually a really good email that came by today that was quite good by Altist. If you're not familiar with Altist, they're probably one of, I guess you could say, one of the most highly regarded, I guess you could say, athletic performance kind of centers slash systems slash organization would be a better word. If you are familiar with the names of like Dan Paff and Stu McMillan, they're the ones that do a lot of work there. But they sent out this really good email on survivorship bias, and essentially they gave, I guess, an example of how, well, at least a story from World War II I'll cover now, but the story, basically, the US military decided to reinforce their bombers during World War II as it's a classic example of understanding and overcoming survivorship bias. I'm gonna bring this back to lifting and your training as well. But initially, the military examined the bombers that returned from missions, noting where they had sustained damage. The logical but flawed conclusion was to reinforce these areas since they were the most frequently hit. This approach, however, demonstrated a survivorship bias because it only considered the aircrafts that survived their missions and ignored a crucial set of data, the planes that were shot down and did not return. Abraham Wald, a statistician, identified this oversight. He pointed out that the bombers making it back despite being hit were actually proof that these areas could sustain damage and still function. The real areas of concern were those that were not hit on the returning bombers, implying the damage to these areas might have led to the planes being lost. Wald's insight was to suggest reinforcing the parts of the plane that on the surviving aircraft were undamaged, assuming these were the areas that if hit would lead to the plane's loss. And this survivorship bias is probably one of the biggest pushes to certain training methods and training programs, training systems, especially on social media. So for example, some really popular ones, specialization programs. For example, think of Smolov, Shaco, where you're literally like squatting stupid amounts of volume. You'll hear stories of people adding X amount of weight to their squat and how strong it made them. But what you don't hear, or where you don't hear as much of, are guys, which I've talked to many people that have had this problem, guys whose knees basically blew up, the knee pain they got from running something like Smolov. What were some other ones, other programs? I mean, you could even throw Westside in there, the way it would potentially, I don't want to say injure people, but the intensity in which it was trained. You can throw in the Bulgarian weightlifting system, made absolute champions in the Soviet era of Olympic weightlifting, but also it was a war of attrition, where for them, it's just replacing people that got injured. You don't hear about that. You hear about the people that did well on these systems. And that is why if you're going to embark on a program like these, you need to make sure you look at something, I guess you could say, objectively, in a way that, you know, are you looking at something that was successful for this one person or maybe a couple of people, and it's ignoring the people who just couldn't get through that program, didn't make it through that program, whatever it is, because you're likely to fall into the category where it does harm versus good for you. That's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So it's just something to be wary of, especially when you're looking at things online, because it ends up being survivorship bias. I think another really good one would be, a modern one would be something like knees over toes. So knees over toes program, you hear a lot of, well, of course, there are a lot of testimonials being pushed forward, but what you don't hear are the loads of people that had their knee pain get worse going into aggressive, I guess, knee loading training programs. So that would be a very modern example of the survivorship bias based on a modern day, I guess, training system or training program. So just make sure you get a complete picture of what you're doing within your training. If you have any questions, throw them down in the comments. Comment down below survivorship if you have no questions, just to help with the YouTube algo. And if you have questions, I'll answer them in the next video. So if you put them there, I'll make sure to do that, and I'll catch you then.